All right, let's hope that's recording. That is all good. Thank you, James. All right. Welcome everyone to our storytelling workshop, telling new stories for the new economy. My name is Tiana, and before we kick things off, I would just like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the lands that we're all joining from today, and pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. I'm joining from Yuggera country here on the south side of Brisbane. And I also would like to acknowledge that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples have been the original storytellers on this continent. They've been telling stories on this land since time immemorial, and these stories have carried law, knowledge, Indigenous economics, culture, care, and relationships across generations. And as we gather today to talk about storytelling and economic futures, we do so on lands where stories have long shaped how people live, and particularly how they live well together, and how they care for country and understand their responsibilities to one another. So I'll acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded, and these living cultures continue to offer us really important wisdom for imagining more just and life-centered ways of organizing our world. So welcome everyone, and thank you for being here today. Thank you for giving up your Wednesday to spend some time with me and my co-hosts. This session is all about storytelling, and it's really important because economic systems, which is what we're going to be focusing on today in particular, they don't just change through policy alone. They change when the stories that hold them in place begin to shift. And so today is all about understanding the power of storytelling and how storytelling shapes all aspects of our lives, and the world that we live in. And this workshop, this event, is part of Reclaim the Economy Week, which my co-host Tarek will introduce shortly. It's a decentralized global moment, inviting communities and organizations and people all around the world to begin to question dominant economic narratives and demand economies that serve people and planet. So across the world and here in Australia, people are coming together throughout this week to have conversations, host workshops, different actions, and create events that are going to challenge business as usual and highlight some alternatives that are already emerging. So I'll just let you know, if you weren't aware, we have another event happening on the final day of Reclaim the Economy Week, which is this Sunday, the 1st of February. We will be hosting a documentary screening of the film Purpose, which is all about a well-being economy, and it asks the very simple question, what is the purpose of the economy, or what should the purpose of an economy be, and how might we begin to change that? And we will have Catherine Trebek joining us. She is the founder of the Wellbeing Economy Alliance. She'll be joining us after the film to have a lovely discussion alongside a few other wonderful people from the New Economy Network. If you like what we begin to kind of discuss in today's workshop, kind of extending on from what we look at today, I'll be hosting another kind of more hands-on, more intimate workshop that's focused on the work that reconnects. And that will be happening next Wednesday evening. And we'll be looking at the work of Joanna Macy. So I'll kind of introduce this a little bit more later in the workshop, but if the stuff that we touch on that has to do with the work that reconnects is something that interests you, then I invite you to also check out that workshop that we'll be hosting. So I am here today wearing many hats. I have a personal interest in storytelling. I did my PhD in communication for social change. And the thing that drew me into that field, I guess, was the role of storytelling in social change. And in my role with the New Economy Network Australia, or NENA, as we call it, I am the convener of the NENA Storytelling Hub. I've recently started a NENA podcast, where we're beginning to talk to people who are building the new economy movement around Australia and around the world. And I can see my recent episode that just came out with Robert. I can see Robert is somewhere in the Zoom joining me. So it's great to see lots of familiar faces here. And the New Economy Network, or NENA, for those of you who aren't familiar with us, we're a growing network or movement of people and different organizations that are working to transform Australia's economic system so that it serves people, planet, and future generations. And NENA brings together different community groups, advocates, researchers, practitioners, creatives, and just everyday people who, to put it bluntly, give a shit about people and the planet and want to see an economy that also reflects that. And so we have different hubs within NENA. So I'm a part of the NENA Storytelling Hub and also the NENA Systems Change Hub. We engage in research, different collaborations. We host online and in-person events, and we support the development of economic approaches that are grounded in well-being, care, good governance and democracy, regeneration and justice. And Reclaim the Economy Week is an initiative of the Wellbeing Economy Alliance, or WEAll, as it's known. And I'll pass over to my co-host Tarek from WEAll Australia just to introduce WEAll and what this week's all about.
Hey everyone, my name's Tarek. So I'm also a member of the New Economy Network like Tiana, but I'm also a co-convener for the Wellbeing Economy Alliance Australia. So I'm really glad to be on this session with you all and thank you for coming. So very briefly, WEAll is a global alliance working to replace the dominant growth at all costs model with economies instead designed around well-being, care, and ecological health. In Australia, we work to connect movements, support policy shifts, and help grow the conditions for a well-being economy to take root. We're in a very similar lane to NENA, and we collaborate quite a bit. So I want to start by acknowledging that for most of our lives, we've been taught to think about the economy as something distant and technical, managed by experts and measured by graphs and judged almost entirely by whether it keeps growing. However, at the same time, a lot of us are feeling the economy very directly in the cost of living, in housing stress, in burnout, in the ecological loss that we're seeing year after year, and in the sense that something just isn't lining up between what we're told success looks like and how it actually feels, and what we say a thriving society looks like and how our idea of that actually feels in our day-to-day lives. So that tension is really at the heart of Reclaim the Economy Week. So it's a global decentralized campaign that's being run by WEAll Global and Earth for All, where people all over the world are coming together to challenge the idea that the economy is fixed, neutral, or inevitable, and to insist instead that it should be shaped around what actually matters: well-being, care, justice, and the health of the living world. So it explores and brings together a wide range of perspectives from indigenous economics and degrowth to localization, donut economics, rights-based approaches, and well-being economies, because there isn't just one perfect model. There are many, many ways and concepts and ideas of how to move beyond an extractive growth at all costs system. But the one thing that all of those movements share is that when we're talking about them, stories really matter. So that's why I think this is a great session, and I'm really glad that Tiana is hosting it, because the stories we tell about work, success, and value, and productivity, and scarcity don't just reflect the economy, they help to actively create it. And they shape the policy choices, cultural norms, and even what feels possible or imaginable in the first place. So, as Tiana said, this is hosted by the NENA Storytelling Hub, which exists precisely to help shift the narratives that hold our current economic system in place and to support people and organizations to communicate new economic ideas in a way that's accessible, grounded, and human. So, whether you're deeply involved in systems change work, or if you're here simply because you've felt that there has to be a better way than business as usual, I really think that you're in the right place. So with that, I'll hand back to Tiana and she can get started. So thanks again for being here and for being part of Reclaim the Economy Week.
Thank you, Tarek. So we're here to talk about stories and storytelling. And throughout this session, I invite everybody to share their thoughts in the chat, and I will invite us to have discussions throughout. And when I do invite you to kind of contribute to the discussion, feel free to put up your Zoom hand, and I will invite you to come off mute if you just want to share things. Just bear in mind that we are recording this, so your face might end up on YouTube if you're not comfortable with that. But I'd love to hear in the chat to begin with, how would you guys define, or what do you think about when you think about what is a story? I think we all have these kind of assumptions about what story is. And I think it's a good idea to get us all on the same page. I have my own, I guess, definition of story, or what stories are, which I'll share in a moment. But if anyone would like to share in the chat, I invite you to just share what you think of when you think of the word story. And I think Andrea says story is to convey an experience. Yeah. There's two words that are often used interchangeably that I think is a good idea to also define, and that's story and narrative. And I think a story is more specific. A story is something that we can have an individual story, whereas narrative is the broader patterns that many stories over time begin to reinforce. And I'm seeing lots of great things in the chat. A plot and a journey, lessons disguised in joy and emotions, a way of making sense of the world, a way of recording history, connecting shapers of worlds and ways of being, a life experience told in emotional terms, telling history, relationship, stories are for learning, giving meaning to experience, universal patterns expressed in one's unique way. Lots of great insights here. And I agree with all of these. I personally like to think of story as simply a way of making sense or giving meaning to events, facts or figures, or just, as I like to term them, happenings, patterns. There are events that happen in the world, in our lives, or we see facts and figures. And story is essentially our brain's way of connecting these things and making sense of them and drawing conclusions about why these things happen or how these things happen. And so I think if we just carry that idea with us throughout the rest of this workshop, it'll keep us all on the same page. How does story shape the world we live in? I think we've already seen some suggestions in the chat about how people see story showing up in the world. But I'd love to know if you guys can think of any specific ways that stories shape the world we live in. I've seen a lot of people say stories are about our history, which I think is a great one. Stories help define what is thinkable. I like that word, thinkable. Stories share our vision and they build our vision. Great. Lots of great suggestions. A reflection, absolutely. Whoa. And so the stories that we tell in our day-to-day lives are stories about our history, like you guys have said. So history isn't just an account of what happened. It's not just an account of the events. It's the stories that we tell about the past. And it also it's what we include in those stories that matter. It's what we leave out of those stories, and how we explain cause and effect, or things like responsibility. And so we can begin to ask questions when we think about our history, like whose stories are being centered, whose experiences are being marginalized, what's getting framed as progress or success, what gets framed as collateral or damage throughout history. Things like values. And I think with January 26th, just a few days ago, I've seen lots of lively discussions about what we value as Australians online from different sides of politics. And our values are essentially the stories that we tell about what matters to us as people. So when we say something is valuable, we're essentially telling a story about why that thing matters. Whether that deserves our time, our attention, our protection, our money, whatever it might be. Someone else mentioned it before. I think Susan said that stories build our visions, and they also share our visions. And so when we think about our vision and the future, our visions are essentially the stories that we tell ourselves about what futures are possible or desirable. And so our visions answer questions like what kind of world could exist? What is maybe a realistic vision of the future or an unrealistic vision? And if the dominant story says that, there's no alternative, then our imagination begins to shrink. And so if the story says, change is possible, then it opens up different pathways for us. Our identity, I think somebody said before that story is about reflections, and I really like that. Our identity is essentially a story that we tell ourselves about who we are, whether that is as individuals or as a collective, as a community, as a country, whatever it might be. And so our identity as a story is the stories that we tell ourselves about the kind of person or people that we believe we are. What roles feel natural to us or off limits to us, and what we think we're capable of, or what we think we're capable of influencing. If we tell a story that says something like, I'm not political, or I'm just one person, or I'm not an expert, then that quietly begins to shape how we show up in the world, often more than more formal barriers might. Our institutions and social systems are built on stories that we begin to make official. So our, legal systems, our policy frameworks, all of these things are underpinned by assumptions that kind of are based on our cultural stories that we tell. It's what people are motivated by, what counts as success, or what counts as morally good or morally bad, and what is considered to be normal or rational. And then we have the economy. And the economy itself can also be seen as a set of stories. It's a set of stories about what counts as work, what counts as valuable, what is considered to be scarce and what is considered to be abundant, who deserves security, what we ought to protect or what we ought to value. All of these things, all of these stories don't just describe our economic system, but they actively produce it. And somebody said there, it's almost like a self-fulfilling prophecy in action. And I think that's absolutely right. These stories that we tell about the economy begin to feed back into the economy, and they begin to actively shape and reproduce it. So this is just a little bit of an overview of some of the ways that stories show up in the world and in our society. And I want to shift our focus to how stories shape our economic systems in particular, or any kind of complex social system. When we talk about changing the economy or, economic systems, most people probably fall towards things like shifting policy. How do we set new rules, new targets, new incentives? But complex systems don't just behave the way that they do because of policies alone. They behave the way they do because of how they're structured, and the paradigms that they're built upon. Now, this is one of my favorite ways of thinking about the importance of stories when it comes to social change. And this is from a body of work that I'm sure many people here are familiar with. And if you're not familiar with it, don't worry. But this comes from the work of Donella Meadows, who was a wonderful systems thinker. And I think she first wrote about this. It was an essay that she wrote, and then it later became a part of her broader body of work, Thinking in Systems. And it essentially looks at the 12 places that we can intervene to change systems. And if we look at it like a bit of a lever or ways that we can get leverage, the deeper we go into the system, we see that it's more difficult to change those things, but those are the things that are going to have the most leverage. So we have paradigms at the end, and that is without a doubt the hardest aspect of a system to change, but it's the part of the system that has the most leverage. Whereas if we go to the other end, and I hope you guys can see my mouse there, but if we go all the way to this end where we have those more structural elements of a system, then these are the things that are easier to change, but they don't have as much effectiveness when it comes to changing the overall system. Now, I talk a lot about systems thinking in some of the work that I do, and I run a course called Systems Thinking for Social Change Makers. And so we focus a lot on this. And it's definitely something that I'm thinking maybe later in the year I might run for NENA, where we can really have a look at applying systems thinking and some of these frameworks to creating systems change for the economy. But for now, I just want to focus on these different leverage points in a system and how story kind of feeds into different aspects of them. So if we look at this part of the system here where we have feedback and delays, this is where a system, a complex system, will begin to reinforce itself or correct itself. And so the structures within a system often create feedback loops where we have these patterns that reward some behaviors and punish other behaviors. And so storytelling shapes a lot of the feedback loops in these complex systems because it helps to define what counts as success, what is framed as failure, who we begin to blame when things go wrong. And so if inequality, as an example, is framed as a personal failure, then the system is going to reinforce something like competition. Whereas if the system frames inequality as structural, then the feedback loops within that system are going to begin to shift towards redistribution and care for one another. Oh, and JP has shared the original paper by Donella Meadows in the chat. Thank you for that. I definitely recommend everybody check that out if you're kind of new to systems thinking or you want a bit of a refresher, because it really shifted the way I think about changing complex systems in a lot of the work that I do. If we go a little bit deeper into the system to where we have the systems and structure, this is how the system is essentially organized to behave. This is where the system structure begins to shape things like how power is distributed, how decisions are made, exactly what feedback loops are prioritized, whose voices can shape the outcomes. And these structures within the system, they don't just emerge randomly. They are built to reflect stories about how the world works. And so if the story says that, the market knows best, then decision making is going to become really centralized and focused on financial institutions. If the story says individuals are responsible for their outcomes, then risk is going to be pushed onto individual people rather than on the social systems. And if the story says something like, efficiency matters more than care, then the structures within the system are going to prioritize things like speed, scale, profit above people's well-being. And so over time, these stories within the system structure become embedded within our organizations and organizational hierarchies, economic incentives, governance models, the way we fund things within our society. And then we get to the kind of deepest leverage points in the system, which is the paradigm. And this is essentially the set of assumptions or the worldview from which the entire system arises. And so a paradigm begins to ask questions or answer the questions like, what is an economy for? what is a human being? What are our roles in society or in the world? What do we owe one another? What is our relationship to the living world? These are all assumptions, but the paradigm in which we live in makes these things feel like they're facts, like they're objective facts. And so we often forget that we can change these things. So these stories that we tell ourselves when we talk about the paradigm of our system, these stories essentially shape everything that comes downstream. So it shapes the goals of the system, the structures of the system, the rules of the system, and all of the outcomes. And so this is why Donella Meadows argues that shifting paradigms is the most powerful, yet the most difficult form of systems change. And you can't change a paradigm through policy alone. Paradigms will only shift when we have new stories that can begin to circulate widely, when lived experience begins to very clearly and very obviously contradict those dominant narratives that are being told, when people have a shared language for what they're already beginning to feel, and when alternative ways of living or being can become visible and credible. And so storytelling does this by naming what the dominant paradigm that we're living in might hide. Storytelling can legitimize different values and different goals. Storytelling makes new structures and new possibilities imaginable for us. And storytelling can help people to feel empowered and to see themselves as active participants within the system and not just passive subjects. So, storytelling doesn't just describe the system, it actively creates the conditions in which the system and different systems can exist. And so, if storytelling shapes these paradigms, the question kind of becomes, what is the story or the stories that are currently shaping the world that we live in? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the chat, or if anyone feels brave enough to raise their hand and come off mute. What do you think is kind of the dominant story or stories that are being told about the world we live in and the economy in particular? April says scarcity. Absolutely. I think that one of the dominant stories we're being told is one of scarcity, that we don't have enough. Productivity and exponential growth is the measure of success. Absolutely. Fear, I agree. The idea of individual success, that's a big one. We've got extraction. This idea that, yeah, competition is necessary for innovation. That's one that drives me nuts. That we are not inherently enough. That's a big one. I think this idea of like scarcity, like we experience it in our own like individual lives. We think that, we ourselves are like not enough. The separation of people, story, and place, neoliberalism. What specifically is like the story of neoliberalism? If we like accept that neoliberalism is kind of like the system that we live in, what's the story of neoliberalism or the paradigm that's kind of holding it in place, Jeff? Competitive is a natural state. That's another one that drives me nuts. This idea that humans are inherently competitive. Really old assumptions about the market regulating itself, and that's the best way to improve the benefits for all. Absolutely. Yeah, this idea that there must be winners and losers, separatism as a main perception, and the unity of all of life and how much we need each other seems undervalued or unvalued. XYZ is human nature. Yeah. This idea that all of our bad traits are it's a part of human nature and not a way that humans have been conditioned to behave because of the paradigm that we live in. The idea that the economy is neutral, yeah. Buying things, yeah, consumption, absolutely. It is how it is. Yeah, that's a very unempowering or disempowering mindset. Neoliberalism accounts for institutions to apply the narrative. Yeah. Neoliberalism, I guess, yeah, it tells us that, we have to give away our power to these larger organizations or actors. Meaning is found outside of ourselves. Convenience and personalization is paramount. Absolutely. That the world is not safe. Yeah. That humans are consumers. Absolutely, Kelly. I think that's like one of the craziest things about living in like a capitalist system is that we've become to like identify, or we see our role within a society as consumers, like first and foremost. The delusion that we have infinite resources on a finite planet and that we are the superior species where those resources are there for us to exploit and consumption is progress. Absolutely. These are all really great examples of the stories that are currently shaping the world that we live in. What I would like to do now is shift to three dominant stories of our time. And this comes from a body of work called The Work That Reconnects that I did mention at the start, which is a body of work and a set of practices that were developed by Joanna Macy, who passed away last year. And it's a body of work and practices that are designed to help people respond to the social, ecological, and also emotional impacts of living in a time of profound change. And as a body of work, the work that reconnects supports individuals and communities to process things like grief, fear, and uncertainty about the world, while also reconnecting with hope, our agency, our sense of purpose. And at its heart, the work that reconnects recognizes that our inner worlds, our relationships, and our wider social systems are deeply interconnected. And within this body of work are what Joanna Macy called the three stories of our time, which essentially describes the three different narratives that people use, often subconsciously, to kind of make sense of the world that we're currently living in and the crises that we're facing. And I think this framework is particularly powerful when it comes to thinking about storytelling for social change because it helps us to recognize that change doesn't just begin with facts alone, but it really begins with figuring out kind of the stories that people believe that they are living within. And I think it gives us some of our power back when we recognize that we can choose to live within a different story. And this is something that I often talk about. People often ask me, people think that I'm incredibly optimistic about the world, given how shit things can be sometimes. And I often tell people, I'm not stupid. I'm not just ignoring all of the bad stuff that's happening around me, but I'm somebody who chooses to live in the third story, the Great Turning, which I'll explain in a moment. But the first of these three stories of our time that Joanna Macy explains is business as usual. And this is kind of the story of continuation. And this is, I think, in my opinion, the dominant story that most of our big institutions are probably still operating within. And I would say like the majority of the mainstream population probably operate within. And this is a story that, tells us that, the world is, it's fundamentally stable. Economic growth is, not only normal, but it's necessary. And any problems that we face, whether it's inequality, climate change, ecological breakdown, these can be solved without fundamentally changing how our systems work. The business as usual story tells us that, we just need more. We need more technology. We need more funding, more innovation. And so in this story, progress is measured by things like GDP, productivity, and expansion. Nature is treated as a resource in the business as usual story. And people as individuals are kind of expected to just compete with one another, adapt to what's happening, and just cope with stress. And in the business as usual story, crisis or crises are often framed as these temporary disruptions to the status quo. rather than recognizing that it's probably an indication of larger systemic failure. And so business as usual, I think, really encourages us to engage with adjustment or coping with this current situation rather than motivating us or empowering us to pursue transformation. It kind of just tells us, this story that if we work harder, if we innovate faster, if we manage things better, if we control the environment better, then the system will eventually deliver well-being and deliver positive results, even if there's increasingly more evidence that suggests otherwise. And so this, shapes the economy a lot because this story, the business as usual story, it tells us that, we should be measuring success as a society through GDP, productivity, and profit. It tells us that, our work is primarily valued for its economic output rather than any social contribution. It tells us that care work, community work, ecological stewardship, these things are not valued as highly. They're often undervalued or they remain invisible. And inequality should be treated as, just an unfortunate side effect rather than some kind of structural feature. And so it begins to encourage behavior like competition over cooperation. It tells us that we're responsible for everything as individuals rather than pushing us to pursue collective solutions. And then this idea that we have to adapt to harm rather than transform the system as a whole. So that's the first story. The second story is one that maybe people who are drawn to a workshop like this might find themselves within at times. And that is the story of the Great Unraveling. And this is the story of breakdown. This second story recognizes that what business as usual has tried to minimize, that, many of our social, economic, or ecological systems are failing. And it really highlights that we're living in a time of ecological collapse, widening inequality, social fragmentation, a loss of trust within our wider institutions. And in the Great Unraveling, I almost see the Great Unraveling as like this story that we kind of have to get to in order to like become change makers. It's kind of like that awakening that I think we all have at some point. But to live in that story all the time, we experience a lot of uncertainty, a lot of grief, a lot of anger, and a lot of exhaustion. So the source of this framework is The Work That Reconnects by Joanna Macy. I'm just going to pop that in the chat. And in the Great Unraveling, I think this is where we begin to realize that, it's not a story of individual failure. It's a story of systemic breakdown, where we're beginning to see the costs and the effects of an extractive and growth-driven model that becomes almost impossible to ignore. I think a lot of the times the media, or at least some of the media that I consume, tends to be kind of framed within this story of like the Great Unraveling, where we're constantly reminded about how everything around us is breaking down and, things are only continuing to get worse. And that's what the Great Unraveling story is really about. It's this story that recognizes the current economic model is breaking down socially, ecologically, morally. And there's a lot of ways that this begins to shape how we experience the economy. We begin to see that, in the Great Unraveling, precarity, insecurity, volatility, all of these things, we just kind of look at them as being normal parts of the economic system. And we begin to experience the economy as something that happens to us rather than something that we can actually influence or change. We begin to lose trust in large institutions, our government, markets, whatever it might be. And then we sometimes fall into, having to engage in that short-term survival rather than longer-term thinking. And then that leads to a lot of fear, a lot of burnout, a lot of withdrawal. It can lead to a lot of cynicism about the possibility of change because, we're living in this story where we recognize that the system is failing and we see it all around us, but it's not a particularly empowering story to tell. I think that's a great point that JP has noted in the chat. Great unraveling is, it's known now as collapse awareness, and it's connected to things that we often hear about, the meta crisis or the poly crisis. But this is something that, yeah, Joanna Macy and her colleagues saw happening many, many decades ago. And so the third story within the work that reconnects is the Great Turning. And this is the story of transformation. And this is the story that 90% of the time I think I live in, although I do have my moments where I, fall into the great unraveling. But this is a story of emergence. It recognizes the reality of breakdown that's happening around us, but it refuses to kind of accept this idea that the collapse that we're seeing happening around us is the end of the story. And instead, it shifts our focus to all of the countless actions that are already underway around the world that are beginning to shift how we relate to each other, the economy, and the living world. And so, in the story of the Great Turning, we begin to see that people can reconnect with communities, with care, and with regeneration. We can recognize that there are new economic models that prioritize well-being, sufficiency, and regeneration, and that change is collective. It's something that's, it's unfinished. I like to describe change as, and I apologize to anyone who's listened to me on a podcast or anything, because you've heard me say this a million times, but I think in the Great Turning in particular, we begin to see change not as like this finite endpoint or this goal that we're working towards, but it's this dynamic unfolding of potential that's always happening around us. And I love the phrasing of unfolding of potential. I think Tyson Yunkaporta talks about, the Indigenous scholar, he talks about how in Indigenous culture, they saw creation as kind of this unfolding that was happening. And I think when we think about change as this unfolding, we can move away from this very kind of like linear way of thinking about things. And we recognize that we can't control the outcomes. We don't know what is going to emerge, but what we can control is, the seeds that we plant, because those seeds hold within them the potential for better things to unfold. In the Great Turning, we kind of recognize that change is this emergent thing and it's always unfinished. And we can, in the Great Turning, the economy becomes, a living system that serves our collective well-being. And so the Great Turning as a story can really reframe the economy as something that's, relational, participatory, and alive, something that's shaped by our values as humans or as communities, as well as ecological limits. And so in the Great Turning, when we begin to focus on all of the wonderful actions and initiatives that are happening around the world, that kind of show an alternative way forward, we begin to see, within the economy, value can be measured through things like well-being, sufficiency, resilience, care work, community work, ecological stewardship. All of these things can be recognized, not as these undervalued and underappreciated things that go unnoticed within the business as usual story, but really as foundational to our way of life. Economic activity can be embedded within place, culture, and relationships. And new models can emerge. We can have cooperatives, we can have community well-being, we can have circular or regenerative systems. And so these are the three stories of our time. And it's up to us to decide, not only which of these stories we begin to kind of live in and tell ourselves, but which of these stories we begin to tell other people and begin to use to maybe shape the paradigm of our economic system. Now, I have a couple of questions. Simone says, this is so incredibly powerful. I couldn't agree more. This was such like a pivotal, when I discovered the work that reconnects, like this aspect of it in particular was like so pivotal for me. I'd been, active in the social change space for over a decade. I, did my PhD in communication for social change and was always interested in storytelling. And it was this like simple framework that just like completely shifted the way I think about the work that I do, particularly when it comes to like systems change and using storytelling to change systems. Now we have we have 40 minutes, and we could either go into breakout rooms now, or I think we might wait because I've got a more interactive activity coming up that we'll save for the breakout room. So what we might do is now, I've just got a couple of questions to kind of get us thinking about this framework. I don't want to make any assumptions about what you guys think, but which story do you guys feel is probably the most dominant in our economic system today or in our society today? Us between business as usual and the great unraveling. Business as usual, business as usual. Yep. I feel that like the main, and this is like obviously this is just my own opinion. I don't have any data to back this up, but I feel like the majority of like the mainstream are living within business as usual. And then a lot of us who are probably drawn to the world of social change and things like that probably find ourselves in the great unraveling. And I feel like a lot of the stuff that I see in the media and even a lot of the stuff that I consumed is so focused in or framed within that second story. This idea that, it's the great unraveling and everything is falling to pieces and, the world isn't working. Michelle thinks that the great turning is gradually dawning on people. I think so. Dreaming of the third and trying to surround myself with stories of hope in the third. Absolutely. Yep. So I think we're all kind of on the same page. And, I'd love to know, which story do you personally find yourself living in most often? And does this shift? I mentioned before, I'm generally pretty good at staying within the great turning. And I think it helps doing the work that I do in the social impact space, that I'm constantly, connecting with people and working with organizations that are doing work that reflects the great turning, which I think helps. Having that evidence helps. But sometimes, my close family and friends, they probably think I'm a little bit delusional, and that's okay. I fully accept that. Kelly says definitely the great unraveling. I struggle to remind myself that other stories are possible. Absolutely. Yeah, Jeff has a really good point. The unraveling, the story of the great unraveling gets a lot of clickbait. And it does, especially when we think about news and news media. Like what's going to sell, what's going to draw people in. It's focusing on like all of the despair and all of the breakdown in the world. Very rarely do we see those examples of positive change in the mainstream media. There must have been a morning when an ancient Roman soccer mum woke up and thought to herself, well, there goes the empire. There was a moment when let me get led to some interesting change. I often think about this, and I often think about the fact that, like, if there were newspapers in like ancient Rome, the collapse, as far as I'm aware, and I'm not a historian, but like the fall of like the Roman Empire, it happened so slowly that people living in it didn't really notice until it was like over. Like you wouldn't have just woken up one day and had like a news headline that read like the Roman Empire falls. And so I think that's like a good reminder that when you're living in these things or living in these moments of history, when the collapse is happening around you, it's really easy to focus on all of the negative things. But I think that's the thing that I like about this idea of like the great turning, is that it's slowly happening around me. And while some aspects of like the current system might be collapsing and unraveling, but there's a new system that's already emerging. And that's what I like to focus on. What gives me hope relates to opportunity within problems, and solutions are embedded within chaos and crisis. I often think that as well. And I try to do this in my personal life, but I also kind of suck at this. But like when I'm going through something like personally, like at the moment, I'm coming to the end. Like this is the end of my Saturn return, if anyone's into astrology. But the last like year of my life has just been pure chaos. And I always try to remind myself, like every problem, everything that goes wrong holds within it like the opportunity or the potential for something better. And so when we can reframe all of the problems as being things that hold within them the potential for something better, that's a good way of reframing it. There we go, JP. We are the ones that we've been waiting for. I think we've kind of touched on this, but where do we see each of these stories showing up most strongly right now? I don't know if it's just me, but I feel like the Great Unraveling shows up the most in the media. That could just be the media that I'm kind of fed in my algorithms. Aaron, and I could be pronouncing your name wrong, but says they live between all of the stories, but feel that there is a richness in the Great Unraveling, but it depends on how people respond within and to collapse. I'm not sure there's an unequivocal better that we're moving towards. That seems too linear and destination oriented. Exactly. And that's, I think, the thing that I like about this idea of like the great turning is that there's no destination or endpoint that we're heading to in the great turning. It's this unfolding of potential. And then finally, where do we see signs of the great turning that's already happening around us, even if it's maybe small or fragile? JP first joined NENA when she learnt about the word apocalyptimist. Her response was, my people. Yep. Local community groups is a great example of the great turning. Mumdani, absolutely. I love him. I also love him for getting people to read Heated Rivalry because that is my current obsession. Seeing MMT, modern monetary theory, starting to become a thing. Cosmo-localism, community independence, absolutely. I think this is another reason that I love listening to podcasts. And I guess part of the reason I started a podcast for NENA was to get to talk to people that are doing this work, the work of the Great Turning and beginning to build these new alternative economic systems in their own communities. My foray into the Great Turning was in a group designing co-living community permaculture future. Absolutely. I think permaculture is a great example of like the Great Turning. Yep, Michelle says the rise of permaculture. I couldn't agree more. So the final thing I wanted to touch on before we break into some breakout groups is how stories begin to kind of exist and expand across different scales. So this is my little diagram. It's more or less the same diagram that I actually used in my PhD thesis, except I changed some of the words so that they're less academic sounding. But I think it's important to recognize that when we talk about stories and when we talk about using stories, they don't operate at the same level. Stories or story kind of moves across different scales of our social life. So it begins, with the stories that we tell ourselves as individuals to the stories that we share in our relationships with other people or our wider communities. And those stories begin to kind of expand and spread from that interpersonal level all the way out to the global level. And I like to think of these kind of seven scales as being, they're not like seven scales that are just like on top of each other, but they're inherently connected to one another. You can't really separate you can't separate the global stories that we tell from the millions or billions of individual stories that kind of make up those global stories that we tell. And so I think about this as kind of like I guess, a laminated system. And it's this idea that change unfolds, again, to use that word, unfolding, across multiple interconnected scales. And each of these influence one another. And, they don't necessarily operate in isolation. But I think every story begins at that interpersonal level. And this is, where every story begins. It's where we begin to make meaning. I mentioned earlier that, I kind of see story as the way that we ascribe meaning or make meaning from the happenings in the world or in our life or the events that we experience or the data that we observe, the facts and figures, whatever they might be. And so it's, where we first make meaning. It's those stories that we tell ourselves about who we are. It's the stories that we then have, in conversation with ourselves, and eventually those stories that we begin to have in conversation with other people. Then we get to the kind of relational level, which is where stories are reinforced between people. So stories are shared and affirmed by other people, and then they begin to kind of stabilize. And so this can happen, in our families, in our workplaces, in our friendship groups, in our classrooms, whatever it might be. And if a story is repeated enough times and it goes unchallenged in these situations, then it can begin to almost feel like common sense. And then eventually we get to the community level, which is where we have these stories that kind of begin to define things like belonging. And these, communities, the collective narratives that we tell within a community are the stories about, what is valued, what behavior is going to be accepted or rewarded, what problems or what solutions are considered to be legitimate. And then it kind of expands into the organizational level, which is where stories begin to be kind of formalized into rules and practices. And I guess they begin to solidify. And so stories, at this kind of organizational level become, mission statements, KPIs, the funding criteria of our organizations, the language that we use in professional settings, all of these things. And then eventually it goes from the organizational to the institutional level. And this is where stories begin to be embedded as, how things work or what we consider to be business as usual. And stories become hard to see in institutions because I think that's when they begin to be treated kind of like as facts. And so our economic, legal, policy institutions, they begin to embed all of those assumptions from those stories that we've been telling about things like our motivation as humans, our responsibility and deservingness for different things. And then we get the societal or the macro level, where we have these kind of dominant narratives that, are big stories that kind of organize our society. And so, examples, these narratives shape things like public debate, how the media frames things, our national priorities, what policies are considered to be serious or realistic. And then we get to the level of the global, which is where, we have these stories that kind of travel and they universalize and they travel across or beyond borders. They, present themselves to us as these like universal truths. And so at this scale, stories can often override local knowledge and lived experience, even when they don't fit the context. So I think the key insight that we get when we look at a model or a framework like this is this idea that, it's not a one-way process. Stories don't just flow from the top down, but they also move from our lived experience upwards. And when we begin from the interpersonal, which is the part that we can actually control, the part that we have the most agency, I can't sit here and control the global narrative about the economy, but I can certainly exert my agency through those interpersonal stories that I tell myself and the people around me. They can begin to challenge the dominant narratives. They can begin to reshape institutional assumptions and things like that. And they open the space for new systems, new stories within the system to emerge. And so this is why storytelling is not just about, interpersonal communication. It really is, I think, a lever for systems change. And so there are lots of different ways that we can kind of begin to shift stories at that interpersonal or relational level, from the way we talk about things like work, how we speak about our success or what we define as success for ourselves or for our, friends and family. What we value or how we value things when we talk about things like parenting or caregiving or volunteering or community work as, real economic activity and not just this extra or invisible labor. The way we talk about solutions and things like that, how we respond to despair. These are all different ways that we can begin to shift those stories at the interpersonal level. And I think one of the most powerful things is the way that we have conversations with people and how we have conversations for change. And so I want to finish by sharing two frameworks. And these are very tactical frameworks that I have used in my work doing like social media work for different not-for-profit organizations. But I also think that they're really useful frameworks for the conversations that we have with other people. And so I have two frameworks that I'll share, and I'll also share in the chat a document that has each of the frameworks So I will pop everyone into breakout rooms just for the last part of today. And we will get you to have a little practice at using one of these frameworks. So the first framework is the Outrage, Hope, Action framework. Now you can see this framework is very much designed for like posting on social media. That was kind of how it emerged as a framework, but I think it's a great framework that we can use when we're engaging with people who have maybe noticed a problem with the current system, and we want to, begin to empower them to see new possibilities. So this is a framework that kind of helps us to structure a conversation so that we don't just get stuck in despair or these abstract ideas. And so how the framework works in a conversation, or, if you're posting on social media, or if you're, engaging in an online conversation, you begin with outrage. So, you name a conflict, you name a tension, you name a problem that exists, something that feels unfair, unsustainable, or wrong. And this works because it validates people's lived experience. It creates some kind of emotional situation that gives people permission to actually engage and care. So you say something that, is going to like outrage people and make people think like, oh yeah, I agree with that, or I experienced this, or whatever it might be. And then you shift to hope. So you open up what's possible. Hope isn't just about, pretending that everything's fine, but, we point to the possibility of change. So we say, an example of this in a conversation might be, what if work could be organized in a way that supports our well-being rather than just something that burns us out? You're giving people like a little bit of hope, or something that kind of makes them think, and they go, yeah, well, I guess that's something that kind of gives them a little bit of hope. And then we finish with action. And so this is where we ground the conversation in something that's tangible. So we, if this was like, if you were posting this online, this would be like the call to action. You would say, go and sign this petition, or go and do this. And so in a conversation with people, it invites somebody to take action that grounds them in that hope. So, what's a step in the right direction that people could take? Would you be willing to come to this event with me? Or, you should go and check out the New Economy Network or the Wellbeing Economy Alliance. You're giving somebody an action that they can take, so that they can begin to kind of realize that hope that you've given them is actually possible and something that they can act upon. That's the first framework, the Outrage, Hope, Action frameworks. That's a really good framework for, I think, inviting people in to the great turning. Hook them in with the outrage, then give them the hope when they're in a position that they're ready for it, and then give them an action or a step that they can take to kind of bring that to life. The next framework is the Explore, Equalise, Elevate framework. And this is a good framework to use if you're wanting to respond to resistance, or, if people have objections to something that you're saying. This is a really great framework. So this is one that I probably could have used when I was younger, and I would get in very like heated arguments, with particular members of my family who just, they didn't seem to agree with what I was saying, or they just couldn't understand what I was saying. And this is a framework that I think could have definitely helped in those situations. So it helps you, to really stay in relationship rather than just escalate the conflict or get people to shut down, which I think is key if we're going to have these conversations for change. So the first step is to explore. So you really want to understand what the person's concern is. If somebody says something that, you might interpret as being maybe a little bit racist, or, a little bit whatever it might be, you begin to kind of unpack what's their real concern there. Instead of just responding immediately with an objection, try to understand what deeper concerns they hold that this objection or this thing that they've said might be masking. And so you can say, what exactly about that thing is it that worries you? Or, if somebody thinks that, they object to, you're presenting them an argument for the well-being economy, and then they respond and they say, oh no, that could never possibly work. You say, well, okay, what about a well-being economy feels unrealistic to you? And so you're opening up a space for them to really kind of understand what their true concern is. Then we equalize. So this is really important to kind of build trust and safety with the person. And so we acknowledge and we empathize. We don't have to agree. We don't have to agree with them. We want to make sure that they feel that there's a sense of psychological safety and that they feel genuinely heard in the conversation. A lot of defensiveness can drop when people feel that there's a bit of rapport being built there. So, you say something like, I understand why you would feel that way. Or, it makes total sense that you would have that opinion, given what you've experienced. You say, a lot of people feel exactly the same way. And so this keeps the conversation very relational, which is really key, I think, for the great turning. And if we want to live in this story of the great turning. And then finally, we elevate. So we invite in a new perspective. And, you're not presenting this alternative or this new perspective to someone as like an argument against what they're saying. You're just inviting them to consider it or think about it. And you can only really introduce this once the person feels that, they've genuinely been heard. So sometimes the exploring and the equalizing thing can take a little bit of back and forth because someone might say something and you say, okay, well, what is your concern there? And then you reflect that back to them and they'll say, oh, no, that's not what I mean. And you say, well, okay, this is what I'm hearing. Can you explain it? So maybe the exploring and the equalizing has to go back and forth a little bit until you can get to the elevate. But then, finally, you might get to the point where you can say, well, okay, and you ask questions. Yes, James. Oh, sorry. Can we get, yes, I will get a copy of the chat. Yes. I will figure out how to do that. So yeah, when we elevate, then we're bringing in that new way of looking at things. And so we're just inviting people, what do you think it would look like if we tried to do something, differently or, who do you think is benefiting from the current system or the way things are, whatever it might be. So that is the Explore, Equalise, Elevate framework. And I love them because I think that oh, thank you, JP. I don't know if everyone can save the chat that way, but I can save the chat, so I'll definitely do it. These are two frameworks that we can use when we're posting online, when we're having these conversations online, but also they're really great frameworks for when we're having interpersonal conversations with other people. So we've only got a little bit of time left, but I think it's just the right amount of time to hop into a breakout room and have a go at using one of these two frameworks. So you can pick which one you want. And maybe somebody in the group, if somebody wants to have a go at using the Explore, Equalise, Elevate framework, someone can be like the devil's advocate. That's always fun. Be the person that has, an opposing view or, has a negative response to something that you've said, and then try using that framework to kind of like navigate and get to a point where you might have understanding. So I am going to pop people into breakout rooms. There we go. Well, hopefully everyone can hear me. Yes. Hopefully you guys had some good conversations, and if hopefully you got to have a go at using those frameworks, and if not, you just had a good chat with the people that were in your breakout rooms. Does anybody want to share anything to wrap things up today about the frameworks or about something that came up in the conversations in your breakout rooms? Feel free to unmute yourself or pop it in the chat.
Yep.
Yes,
I just think it feels to me that the main thing is not to push people, not to be too strong. Like both of your different frameworks don't sort of say you're right and they're wrong, or this is what you should be doing. I think that's, to me, that's the big message is to let people figure it out for themselves, but give them ideas on how to do that, or like you say, stories to sort of back up what you're doing and what you're saying and that type of thing. So yeah.
Absolutely. Like when I think about it, like how many of you have ever, changed your perspective on something because somebody came and shoved their opinion down your throat? Like that's not how things happen, It's to use this word again, it is like it's an unfolding. You have to like let it kind of unfold and happen. And so all we're trying to do in these conversations is, invite people in to question, question business as usual or question the great unraveling, whatever story that they're living in, and hopefully invite them into the great turning. So thank you for that, Robin. If anyone else has anything they'd like to share, please feel free. Otherwise, I am going to save the chat because somebody asked me to save the chat. And I will share that. I will also share, I can share the slides from today, and I'll share the link to the document that had those frameworks as well. Thank you all for being with me here today. Thank you for giving up your lunchtime on a Wednesday. I really appreciate it. Hopefully you all got something valuable, some little, nugget of wisdom or something useful that you can kind of take forward in the work that you might be doing. And as always, check out the upcoming events that we have with the New Economy Network. We have our film screening this weekend and lots of other exciting things. So enjoy the rest of your day. It was lovely meeting you all or seeing some familiar faces.